There wasn't supposed to be a third attempt. It was over. He was snowblind. Everybody was exhausted. They'd endured weeks of terrible weather. They should all go home. And then once again, Mallory persuaded that there should be a third attempt and he should take Andrew Irvine, this very inexperienced young guy.
Confronted with failing to climb Everest for a third time, British climber George Mallory pushed his team to take one last shot for the summit. Early on June the 7th, 1924, he set out with Andrew Irvine, who was only 22 years old. They were spotted from base camp only once. As the cloud briefly lifted, someone glimpsed two figures high on the ridge, gone again in a moment. They were approximately 1,000 feet, or 300 metres from the summit. This would be the last time Mallory and Irvine were ever seen alive. But were they able to reach the summit before the mountain claimed them? I'm Hugh Taylor, and you're listening to The Art of Adventure, a podcast brought to you by Arthur Beale, outfitters to sailors, adventurers, explorers, and vagabonds for over 500 years. What happened at the top of Everest that day is one of the greatest mysteries in mountaineering history, and has given rise to countless theories and even inspired people to retrace their steps to try and find answers. And with a character like Mallory at its heart, it's easy to get wrapped up in the romance and the myth. So what really happened? What motivated Mallory to go for that third attempt? And why do these events continue to fascinate us over 100 years later? Well, Mick Conefrey is here to help us find out. Mick is a filmmaker and author who has examined all the details of Mallory's final climb in his book, Fallen, asking not what we wish happened, but what the record actually allows us to say. Morning, Mick. Thank you very much for joining us. I mean, Mallory is a subject that has captivated generations of not only climbers, but people throughout the world. But if we go back to the beginning, I want to ask about Everest. When did people start talking about climbing it or even think about climbing it?
That happened in the 1850s, and at that time, India was part of the British Empire. They embarked on this large-scale mapping exercise, and from the plains of India, not actually from Nepal or Tibet itself, they measured the height of Everest. And it took them several years to actually compute all the measurements that they had put together. But by the end of the 1850s, they had announced to the world that they had found the highest mountain in the world. And the British surveyors, a lot of whom were Indian, or most of whom were Indian, they were able to measure it with astonishing accuracy. I mean, I think they measured it at 29,002 feet, something like that. And now we think of it as 29,029 feet, but it may have gone up a couple of feet in recent. People argue about the absolute height. But what's amazing is that they were all so close to being absolutely correct and measuring it from hundreds of miles away. Astonishing, really.
Yeah, trigonometry at its best.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then how come it took almost 70 years before people started planning to climb it and conquer it? And I know obviously we had the First World War halfway through that, but what was the delay?
The delay was political because Tibet and Nepal were both independent countries and didn't want to allow foreigners in. Virtually from the moment Everest was discovered and identified as the highest mountain in the world, people were making plans to climb it. The famous story is that on the polo field in Chitral, which is now in Pakistan, that France's young husband and Charles Bruce talked about making an ascent of Everest. This was kind of the 1880s, I think, but they couldn't get in. The border between India and Nepal and Tibet was quite porous. And famously, Captain John Knoll crossed the border, a British officer, in I think 1911, and to attempt to survey and photograph Everest. The Alpine Club and Royal Geographical Society tried to get into it before the First World War, but basically they couldn't because nobody would let them. The Nepalese were absolutely against it, and the Tibetans didn't like the idea of it. What changed was that Tibet basically asserted its independence over China. And at that point, they wanted Britain as an ally. Specifically, they wanted weapons from the British. So there was a change of heart. And also the Dalai Lama at the time was quite pro-Western. So after a lot of diplomatic arm twisting, finally they got permission in 1920 to make an attempt.
And then by the time the First World War had finished, Britain had in effect been beaten to the North and South Pole. Shackleton, although he'd saved his men, had in effect failed. How important was it for the British to be the first to Everest?
You know, I don't agree with all of this stuff about the Everest being seen as the third pole. At the time, in the 1920s, they didn't talk about it like that. This sense of an inferiority complex that, you know, that we've been beaten to the North and South poles. Never had any sense from the historical records that that was present. This is a modern interpretation which people put on it. I've never found this sense. The British climbers wanted to climb Everest before the First World War, and they would have done if they could have got permission to get in. It was only after the First World War that they got permission to actually enter Tibet, so it only became possible. So I've never thought that the polar stuff was that relevant. Sure, there were geographical races, but the main impetus, they wanted to get into Everest from the moment it was discovered. They couldn't do because of the political situation, because Tibet and Nepal were closed countries. Only after the First World War were they allowed into Tibet. Only after the Second World War were they allowed into Nepal. So the political factors were much more important than any kind of notion of races and feeling defeated and wanting to be the first to the third pole. That just wasn't the case.
And then in terms of the sort of influence of the First World War and its outcome, because, you know, there are some people who say that because Britain had such a terrible war and so many climbers had been there and lost loved ones and close friends, that the feeling was that they should go out and risk their life to get over the guilt they felt for surviving the First World War.
You know, I think that's a load of nonsense. And this is something which has come about more recently, and it is principally to do with Wade Davis's book, Into the Silence. I don't buy into it at all. You know, the first British climber to die in the Himalayas was Alfred Mummery on trying to get up Nanga Parbat in the 1890s. Plenty of British climbers died in the Alps in the Victorian era. People knew that climbing was a dangerous, risky occupation. And so the idea that they would have been traumatized by the First World War and would have felt that it was necessary to do this, I don't see the connection. I mean, sure, look, listen, a lot of the climbers on the first couple of expeditions had been involved in the First World War, but not all of them. For example, George Mallory, if you look at his record in the First World War, most of the time he was not at the front line. He did feel survivor's guilt. And there's a kind of a letter from him to his father where he says, you know, in some ways, I wish I hadn't survived. And certainly there was a little bit of a feeling of that. But the other thing to remember is that, sure, you could say that most of the people who were involved in those British early expeditions were soldiers, but most of them were soldiers before the First World War. And the people like General Bruce, the people like Norton, had done their soldiering on the northwest frontier in India, where it was as brutal in its own way as the First World War. It wasn't industrialized carnage, but make no mistake, if you were a British officer in Afghanistan or on the northwest frontier, this was pretty dangerous, pretty threatening, pretty violent stuff. And so this focus on the First World War, I think kind of, you know, is an exaggeration. I'm sure it must have been there a little bit. But I think the idea that they felt this survivor's guilt, or conversely, they felt this necessity to go out and live life to the full, belies the fact that long before the First World War, that's why people were going mountaineering.
So you mentioned Mallory there. Obviously, he's what we're here to talk about today. So can you tell us a bit about him? How did he get this reputation as one of the most acclaimed mountaineers of his era?
Well, you know, I don't want to sound like a party pooper, but if we go back a little bit, Mallory was acclaimed as the greatest climber of his era. What does that really mean? If you look at Mallory's climbing career, what did he do? and what motivated him as a climber. He did quite a lot of climbing in North Wales and the Lake District. He did a certain amount of climbing in the Alps, but that was limited because of the First World War stopping him from going to the Alps every year. And then he did a certain amount in the Himalayas. But when he went to the Himalayas with the British expeditions, and indeed he was the only climber who was on all of the expeditions, on the reconnaissance, on the 1922 expedition, on the 1924 expedition, arguably he was the most experienced high-altitude climber of his era. But that's still very limited. I mean, there was such limited access to the Himalayas that to say you're the most experienced climber didn't mean that much, because there weren't any experienced climbers. If you look at now, the top professional climbers or the world's greatest climbers, Reinhold Messner and the people who have followed him, they will have been up every high peak in the Himalayas. There was very little climbing. So when you say he was the greatest climber, what do you actually mean by that? And secondly, if you look at the way what Mallory himself got from climbing was that I think this idea that he was obsessed with going up Everest has to be qualified. If you read Mallory's journals and his diaries and all that, mainly letters, he mainly sent letters. That's how we know Mallory. He wrote a lot of letters. He loved climbing, but he loved the sociability of climbing. He got much more of a thrill, I think, out of going to Wales and climbing with his friends on Snowdonia and around there than he did on going to Everest. He was very ambivalent about going to Everest. Every time he was asked, virtually, he said he didn't want to go. In the first instance in 1921, when he was asked if he would want to go on the reconnaissance, he didn't want to go. It took his very good friend, Geoffrey Winthrop Young, who said to him, look, you should go. And he didn't say you should go to Everest because of the climbing opportunities. He said you should go to Everest because you might become famous because of it. And if you become famous, then all of the other things that really interest you, your interest in politics, your interest in education, doors will be opened. When he came back from the reconnaissance, he wrote a letter and he said, I don't want to go back. I don't want to waste my time spending months kind of on this mountain with maybe no chance of success, and had to be persuaded to go back in 1922. And then again in 1924, it was a very close thing as to whether he would go at all. For a long time before the team was finally chosen, he basically said, I don't want to go. And he opted out of actually being a member of the team. And in a sense, the kind of tragedy of 1924 was that by this point, Mallory got a lot of the things that he wanted. He'd got a good job in Cambridge. He'd just moved house. He'd got a large and growing family, which he was feeling much more at home with. And so therefore to go to Everest was a real dilemma for him. And he felt that there was a kind of pressure from his comrades. He felt there was a pressure, in a sense, from the country. He knew that the Everest Committee wanted him to go. And he himself wanted to go because he felt it was unfinished business to an extent. And yeah, it was a job which he'd started and he wanted to get through to the end. But equally, a lot of the time he didn't want to go, and he was looking around for people to tell him he couldn't go. He wanted his wife to say, no, you can't go. He wanted the University of Cambridge to say, no, you can't go. But nobody would say to him, no, you can't go. And eventually he agreed to go. But he was very ambivalent about it. He wasn't sure. And as I say, my feeling about Mallory from reading his letters, it's just my opinion, is that what he loved about climbing was the sociability of it. He loved the aesthetics of it. He wrote a famous essay called The Mountaineer as Artist. He had this very synesthetic appreciation of mountains. And all of those things were satisfied, as far as he was concerned, with going to the Alps or going to North Wales, going to the Himalayas, spending 6 months away from home when he couldn't do the job that he wanted to do, when he couldn't be with the family he wanted to be with, were kind of deeply frustrating for him.
Do you think his reputation was sort of enhanced because, he was considered an intellectual, he's part of the Bloomsbury set, he was incredibly good looking and quite often the public face of the Everest Committee?
I think there's a couple of different things there. I think the fact that he was good looking made a big difference. I think that he was definitely the public face of the Everest Committee. He lectured more than anyone else. He was sent to America when they wanted to raise funds in America. He contributed writing quite a lot of the books, although I'm not sure if he was credited. So he was definitely the public face of it. I think now people care about the fact that he was in the Bloomsbury set and that he was friends with these painters and Duncan Grant, and he was part of that world. I think that's more of a modern thing. At the time, that wouldn't have been thought of as an important part of it. But he was definitely the public face of it. I think as well, to be quite honest, a very simple thing that he had such a fantastic name. Mallory of Everest, he was nicknamed Galahad by Geoffrey Winthrop Young. And, that Mallory, the writer of Mort d'Arthur, it was a quintessentially English name. It did sound like an English knight. And he had all these kind of heroic qualities, or heroic external qualities, certainly.
You mentioned his speaking tour in America, and where he famously said, or was alleged to have said, "Why do you want to climb Everest?" And he replied, "Because it's there." What's your take on that quote?
I think that was typical of Mallory. A lot of people have written, well, I don't think he said it. This was made up by the journalists. Other people said, well, he didn't really mean it. He just wanted to fob some journalist off and head for the bar. Well, first of all, there was no point in heading for the bar because when he was in America, he was in the middle of prohibition. I think Mallory was very astute as a kind of self-publicist and publicist. And if you look at the text of the speeches he gave when he was in America, he would quite often start with this thing. He'd say, what's the point in climbing Everest? There is no point. And then he would say, well, it's not about there being a point. It's about the human spirit. There's no single good reason for doing it. And so my take on because it's there, I think that's exactly why he said it. He was very astute. He understood the power of publicity. He understood the power of words and coming up with a little pithy phrase.
You mentioned that obviously he was involved in all three Everest expeditions. Perhaps you can tell us about the recce and then the first expedition before we move on to the 1924 one.
Everybody thought that Everest would be relatively easy to climb. The only way they could judge it was comparing it to the Alps. And although obviously Everest is a lot higher than the Alps, you're starting from about 15,000 feet, something like that, where base camp is, and you've got to get up to 29,000 feet. And so I think when people were thinking about how long it would take, they thought about how fast they climbed in the Alps. And so they thought they would climb it quickly. So they went off on this reconnaissance. They got there. Mallory thought, oh, well, maybe we can climb it on the reconnaissance. They were so unrealistic in their understanding of the difficulties of climbing at altitude. The main mission of the first expedition was to come back with a map and work out the best approach to climbing Everest. And the route they found was to go via Tibet, or the modern-day Tibetan side, which is not the side which is easiest to climb. It's much easier to climb it from Nepal. That's why more people do it now. Then in 1922, having got within sight of what they thought was this ridge, which was going to take them to the top of Everest, they decided to come back and they thought they would finish the job. Again, they had an unrealistic, appreciation of how difficult it was going to be. And they got very high, astonishingly high for the day, but they really were a couple of thousand feet short of the summit because nobody had been to altitude. Nobody really knew. Some scientists told them that they couldn't stand on the top of Everest. You would die because of the lack of air and the low air pressure. Some people said you had to use oxygen, but the trouble was the oxygen equipment was so poor at the time and so primitive that there was no guarantee that it would work. But they had this sort of naive belief that it was going to be quite straightforward, really, But then on the other hand, they got astonishingly close. I mean, that's the thing. They did astonishingly well. They broke the world record in 1922 for the highest altitude easily. Finch, another climber on the expedition, actually went higher than Mallory using oxygen. So they did amazingly well. And then in 1924, when they came back, I mean, at the very least, they got to 28,000 feet, 1,000 foot short of the summit, again, smashing all the altitude records that they'd set 2 years earlier and getting so close to the summit. Phenomenal, really.
And sort of going back to the 1922, the very last attempt to reach the summit ended in disastrously. Perhaps you can tell us a bit about that and what led up to that.
Unfortunately, this was, in a sense, Mallory at his worst. They'd always planned that there would be two attempts in 1922. One would be with oxygen, one would be without. Mallory, although he wasn't he wasn't the leader of the expedition, he wasn't even the climbing leader, but de facto he was the climbing leader because everybody thought he was the best climber. And so he led the first attempt on the summit without oxygen and got to over 27,000 feet. But they were still a couple of thousand feet short of the summit. Then there was a second attempt led by George Finch, who was an Australian chemist who was living in Britain at the time. And he got higher than Mallory and the people who tried without oxygen. And then Mallory decided, maybe partly because he didn't want to come back, that they should have a third attempt. And nobody else thought this was a good idea. Everybody thought they were exhausted, too ill to make a third attempt. But Mallory really pushed for a third attempt, and he persuaded Finch, who had just come down from his own attempt, to join him. The idea was that they would use oxygen, and they headed up the mountain, But everybody knew that they couldn't really do this. Finch was clearly not fit enough. And certainly the weather was changing. It was getting warmer. There was more snow. And eventually they got to the point where Finch had to turn back. But Mallory pressed on. They got to effectively their advanced base, but they had to go further up the mountain to start the attempt proper. And they were hit by a huge avalanche. And it was amazing that everybody wasn't killed because the avalanche came out of nowhere and covered everybody in snow. And the amazing thing was that none of the British climbers were killed. And they all remarked upon it, said, how come we survived? But perhaps it was simply because they were in the lead or the position they were. But 7 of the porters died, fell off the mountain into a huge crevasse below. They managed amazingly to rescue some of them, to actually yank them out of the crevasse, but 7 of them died. And Mallory felt tremendous guilt for this. And perhaps that informed his thinking in 1924. I don't know. I mean, it is possible that he thought, so many people have died for this, that if we can get up it, at least it will be some kind of redemption, that all the effort will have been worthwhile. And he certainly felt a strong sense of guilt. And the amazing thing about this, if you're looking back, is that when the reports came back to England, the Sherpas and porters weren't named in the press reports. Nobody knew who they were. The first time anybody knew what the names of the porters were was in 1924 when they built a cairn or a monument to commemorate the death of Mallory and Irvine. At that point, they put a list of all of the people who had died on the mountain. And that was the first time anybody knew the names of the porters, which is pretty awful, isn't it, really? There certainly was no inquest afterwards. Certainly some of the people thought it was Mallory's fault, undoubtedly. And if you look at the correspondence between General Bruce, who was the leader of the expedition, who felt that he'd been railroaded into it, and some of the other people at the Alpine Club and the doctor on the expedition, they said Mallory, he wasn't experienced enough with snow. He didn't realise the dangers. And they were quite critical of him. But at the same time, they also recognised that this was virtually the first time anybody had tried to do anything like this. That, as I say, there had been deaths in the Himalayas before, but there'd been so few expeditions that nobody had any knowledge of snow conditions. So they just kind of said, this is one of those things that happens when you go mountaineering. This was part and parcel of the sport.
And obviously, he's the last person chosen, I think, for the 1924 expedition, or the last person who agrees to go on it. And because of what happened in 22, he was not made expedition leader. Perhaps you could tell us a bit about that?
No, I would disagree with that. He wasn't made he was never going to be made expedition leader because people didn't think he was the right person to do it. In 1922 and in 1924, the expedition leader was Charles Bruce, a soldier, and they recognised that he had the qualities of organisation and of leadership to do so. And his deputy was Edward Norton, who, again, a very successful soldier. But Mallory, nobody would have made him leader. He wasn't that sort of person. He was notoriously disorganized, and that wasn't his job. So it wasn't because of the deaths at the end of 1922. It was simply that he would never have been considered. So they went to Everest in 24 with a big fanfare, thinking that we'd gotten very close in 1922, and so this expedition would be successful. Mallory was very ambivalent about joining the team because he wanted to stay home. But once he had made that decision, then he was very full-blooded about it. Again, they had this kind of plan to go to the mountain and make a number of attempts. Mallory made this conversion, and he decided at this point that oxygen was the only way they could get to the top. But yet he was a total technophobe, didn't understand the technology, but was convinced that it was necessary. So again, they had the idea that there would be 2 attempts. They had a route now. They knew where they would put the camps. They had a plan. General Bruce, the original leader, had to drop out, but his deputy, Norton, was very able. But the weather was much, much worse than it had been in 1922 or 21. And they had setback after setback until they got to the point where they decided that they would only have 1 attempt on the mountain, which would be without oxygen because they couldn't carry the oxygen up the mountain to get to the point where they could use it. And Mallory was originally going to do that attempt with Bruce, but then Bruce couldn't do it. There was a second Bruce on the expedition called Geoffrey Bruce. But they made a kind of half-hearted attempt. It didn't work. Then there was a second oxygenless attempt led by Edward Norton with Howard Somerville. And amazingly, without oxygen, they got to 28,000 feet, which was astonishing, really, because they probably got to the height of K2 and Kanchenjunga. So in 1924, without oxygen, which is quite amazing.
And then that leaves us up to the 3rd attempt.
Well, again, those sort of echoes of what happened in 1922, because there wasn't supposed to be a 3rd attempt. As far as Norton was concerned, when he came down the mountain after reaching 28,000 feet, that it was over. He was snowblind. Everybody was exhausted. They'd endured weeks of terrible weather. They should all go home. And then once again, Mallory persuaded that there should be a 3rd attempt and he should take Andrew Irvine, this very inexperienced young guy, and use oxygen. Even though Irvine didn't want to use the oxygen, he wrote back home that he would prefer not to be using it. And whether he didn't want to use it because he thought it was unsporting or because he just knew the oxygen equipment didn't work, it's impossible to know. So you had this kind of strange situation where you've got Mallory, who's a technophobe, climbing this mountain with oxygen, even though he doesn't know how to use the equipment, taking this young person who's got hardly any experience at all, but is a brilliant engineer or a very good engineer by all accounts, using oxygen equipment which fundamentally doesn't work. So it's kind of not a recipe for success, is it, unfortunately?
So when Mallory and Irvine set off on this 3rd attempt, before we get into the unknown, what do we actually know, how far they got or what happened or who saw them on the way up?
Very, very little is known. Basically, they set off from their advanced base or from this camp on the North Col, which is the kind of highest camp. They got 1 camp higher. Mallory sent down a note. They got another camp higher. So they're pretty high on their last camp, but they're not keeping their diaries. It's obvious that Irvine has left his diary behind. Well, it's not obvious, but it looks very likely he left his diary behind. So Mallory sends down a note and he says, look, we're going to make an attempt tomorrow. And he sends it to the cameraman, John Knoll, saying, keep your camera trained on the ridge tomorrow morning. You're going to see me, or if not on the ridge, you'll see me in this other gully, which Norton had used. And that's about it. And then what happens is that on the day, another climber goes up and he looks up and he sees the mist parts. A lot of the time, like all mountains, the kind of summit is covered in mist. And he spots them and the mist clears and he sees them on this ridge, but precisely where he saw them is very difficult to pin down. And then they disappear, and that's about it.
And do you think he did see them? Because some people say it was Noel Odell, I think, wasn't it? Do some
Yeah.
people say the weather was so bad he can't possibly have seen them?
I think there's no, to me, I think Odell undoubtedly did see them. The only question is, where did he see them? Because, and that has been this thing that people argue the toss about. He said he saw them near a great rock step, but there are two great rock steps on the ridge and possibly a third, depending on what you call a rock step. And so the question is, did he see them getting to the top of the second step, which means that they would have been relatively close to the summit, or did he see them getting to the top of the first step, in which case they were a lot further away? But it's impossible to know because he kept on changing his mind. And also because now people think of them as there being 3 steps. In the 20s, they didn't really. They thought of them as being 2. And when he says great rock step, it's a bit ambivalent. And at some points, Odell seemed to say he thought it was the second step, and at other points he seemed to say he thought it was the first step. So it's very difficult to know precisely where he saw them. But he was always adamant that he did see them, and I think that, so he was a scientist. He had very used to making observations. There's no reason why he would have made it up. And he wrote it in his diary, said saw them, very brief note. So, yeah, I think he saw them, but precisely where, you can't really say.
Obviously, Mallory and Irvine were never seen again. At the time, was the assumption that they didn't make it to the summit?
The assumption changed. It depends on who was assuming. So in 1924, initially Norton and the other climbers on Everest at the time assumed that they hadn't got to the summit. They just thought it was impossible. There was no evidence that they had. Norton had seen how difficult it was, the final 1,000 feet, simply thought Mallory either couldn't have done it or that he would have turned back. He wrote in letters saying, no, Mallory wouldn't have gone on. He would have realised it was too dangerous, particularly that it was too dangerous for Irvine, that he would have felt a duty of care for Irvine and would undoubtedly have turned back. But when the news reached England, particularly Odell's account, where he says, I saw them very high on the ridge, a lot of Mallory's friends said if he was high on the ridge, he must have got to the top. He must have done. He was Mallory. He would have strained every sinew to get to the top. And so that's how you left it, with kind of Norton always saying and writing in the expedition book that he didn't think he'd made it, that he did think he would have turned back, that he would have realised how impossible it would have been. And with Mallory's supporters, particularly those who had a kind of romantic view of climbing, saying, no, he must have got to the top. So that's how it was left. And then in 1999, they found Mallory's body, much to their surprise. Nobody thought they could. And when they went in 1999, they thought they were looking for Irvine's body, not for Mallory's. And to their astonishment, they found his body. And people kind of spent ages and forever arguing about all the details of the day, putting together altitudes, timings, equipment and stuff. There's a kind of very healthy little cottage industry out there of people trying to work it out from the available evidence. But I think there's a whole load of people who try and put the clues together, when his watch stopped, what was in his pocket, what wasn't in his pocket, and try and prove the case either way. And I just think you can't. And I think you have to look at the totality of the evidence. And the totality is a third attempt when everything was going wrong, when everybody's at the end of their tether, when the equipment isn't working, when they're trying to do something which is beyond them. The odds that they succeeded would have been very, very low. And I've always thought that I would simply agree with Conrad Anker, who's the person who found Mallory's body, who's a kind of great Himalayan climber, that the position of the body proves that he didn't get to the top. Because it's very simple. The position of Mallory's body was very close to their final camp. And so it was one thing to believe that Mallory could have somehow, out of an effort of will, pushed himself up the final slope to the top and got there. Just sheer willpower had got him to the top. But nobody believed that he then could have gotten back down almost to his final camp, because that involved quite a lot of horizontal as well as vertical movement. So, if his body was found on the summit, then I think arguably you could say maybe he did get to the top, but his body wasn't found on the summit. It was found quite far away from the summit, 28,000 odd feet. And so you would have to believe that not only did he get to the summit with Irvine, this climber who'd done very little with oxygen equipment, which probably didn't work, with hardly any rope, they didn't carry very much rope, and was able to get all the way back down again and almost to safety. I just think that's just a sort of, that's a wish too far. I'm not saying it's impossible. Who knows? I mean, nothing is impossible, but it's very unlikely.
But in your opinion, you're pretty convinced he didn't get to the summit.
But you can't rule anything out. But no, I don't think so. And I think that, again, I think it's a convincing and important big bit of evidence where his body was found. His body was found almost in a line directly below where an ice axe was found in 1933. And it makes absolute sense that they were going up the ridge towards the summit. There's an accident. They drop an ice axe. They both fall. Mallory comes to rest. Irvine doesn't. And I just think it's a bit pointless, really, going over tiny bits of information and tiny clues, inverted commas. You have to look at the big things, and the big things imply to me that he didn't.
So the first actual summit of Everest was in 1953?
Yeah, absolutely.
Why did it take so long from when the 1924 expedition to summit in 1953?
Again, why did they succeed in 53 when they hadn't in 1924? The first thing is that they almost succeeded in 1924. For definite, Norton got to 28,000 feet. So they almost got to the top. But arguably, it was always going to be easier to get to the top from the Nepalese side or Nepalese side, and they weren't allowed to get into Nepal until the 50s. So what happened was that after 1924, they were banned from going back to Tibet. Again, it's politics. It's nothing about climbing or science. They weren't allowed into Tibet until 1933. There were several other British expeditions, but by that point, the kind of heart had gone out of it, really. After they failed in 1933, the heart had gone out of it. The public weren't so interested. The climbers themselves weren't quite so interested. But there's a big watershed after the Second World War. Before the Second World War, none of the 8,000-metre peaks in the Himalayas and the Karakoram Mountains had been climbed. After the Second World War in the 1950s, all of them were climbed. A lot of it has got to do with oxygen, but a lot of those 8,000-metre peaks were climbed without oxygen. But certainly equipment developments, better rope, better clothing.
And going back to 1924, how was news received back in Britain with the sort of the failure of the expedition and the deaths of Mallory and Irvine?
I think there was kind of national mourning up to a point, but not as much as, for example, with the death of Scott. Scott wasn't he buried in Westminster Abbey, I think. Maybe this is where the First World War did come in. People said, look, we're going to take it on the chin, just as so many, the flower of English manhood died in the First World War. These people have died on Everest. And there was an acknowledgement that mountaineering was dangerous, and this is what happened. So it was front page news, and a lot of dignitaries went along to Mallory's commemoration. So it did have an impact, but I think because of so many deaths in the First World War, people were unfortunately used to people dying, and they were used to people dying in mountains.
And what was his legacy? What did future generations learn from him?
Well, I mean, it depends. They learned what they wanted to learn. I think Mallory is a symbol of striving, of trying, never giving up. No, he was generally seen as a heroic figure. But, for example, there weren't a rash of books about Mallory. At the time, there was one biography. This kind of obsession with celebrity, only the good die young, is a kind of modern thing. There are many more books that have been written about Mallory in the last 20 years than were written 20 years after his death. But, he was a kind of heroic figure in the sense that he just didn't give up. But arguably, was he a wise figure? Did he make the right decisions? And you could have a very negative view of Mallory and say, look, hang on a minute. At the end of all of his expeditions, somebody dies, and at the end of his expedition, he dies. Sorry, his last expedition, he dies. You know, in 1921, his teammates criticised him for pushing things too far. In 1922, his teammates criticised him for pushing too far. In 1924, he died, and so did Andrew Irvine, his partner. So you could have a very negative view of him. But I think that people didn't and don't, because there's something quite kind of likable about Mallory. There was this kind of comparison they often made with the climbers from that era, and particularly that team, that they were all Peter Pan-like figures. And in some of the photographs of Mallory on Everest, he does look rather Peter Pan-ish. He's very young. The joke was, when he was a teacher at Charterhouse, people thought he was one of the students. There was something young, naive, disingenuous about him, which was likable. And he undoubtedly did have a lot of guts and did push things. But that's always the issue in mountaineering, isn't it? How far do you push things? You know, what is prudent?
Thank you for listening to The Art of Adventure. And thank you very much to Mick Conefrey for joining me. You can find all his incredible books, including Fallen, in any good bookshop. This series is brought to you by Arthur Beale. We've been outfitting sailors, adventurers, explorers and vagabonds for over 500 years. In fact, the very rope that Mallory would have used on this expedition would have come from Arthur Beale. You can find out more about our incredible history at arthurbeale.co.uk. If you enjoyed today's episode, subscribe to us wherever you are listening. We have much more to come. This show was hosted by me, Hugh Taylor, and produced by M. Wally. Theme music is by Nasson De Silva.